Hi guys, we're back to talk more about soil erosion, and this time we'll have our final installment, which is about roads, mostly dirt roads, but other kinds of roads as well. Wait, that's not what I want, this one. So let me share my slides so we can look at some images. Okay, so in areas where we have lots of dirt roads, which might be in forests, if we're kind of thinking about forestry, or could be in other kinds of landscapes as well. There's this kind of common adage that says the three largest contributors to erosion in the forest are roads, roads, and roads. So we could call this problem erosion. So people might think like, oh, you know, driving in the forest, cutting down trees, clear cutting, these are the kinds of things that are contributing to erosion, and they can have an impact. But far and away, the most removal of soil particles that we see just comes off these areas that are in roads. And that's not too surprising if we think about what roads are. They're these big areas where all the natural vegetation, all the horizon has been removed. We've compacted the soils, we've plugged up the macropores, and we've kind of exposed these areas. And those are all the kinds of things that we said can contribute to erosion risk in agricultural landscapes. So when we're making roads this way, we should expect that to be vulnerable to erosion. So this is kind of a multi-fold issue that again kind of mimics some of the same problems that we can see in agricultural contexts. But roads are a problem, one, because the soil is compacted. So when we have soil that's compacted to form a road, which, I mean, there's good reasons why we do that, but that's really reducing the ability for water to infiltrate down into the roads. Even if it's still a dirt road, that dirt is really going to be very limited in its ability to absorb and drain water. And whenever we have limited drainage capacity, we're going to have a lot more surface flow of water. And then when that water is building up on the surface and moving across the surface, that's when it's picking up soil particles and moving them off site. Of course, the way that we make roads is we take the vegetation off the surface. So when we have vegetation, when we have cover on the soil, we know that that limits the contact in between the raindrops and the soil surface. We know those raindrops are good at smacking into the soil surface and tossing up small particles of soil into the air, you know, dislodging them from the other soil particles or aggregates that they might be a part of, and then making them more vulnerable to be moved off site. And so also vegetation just slows down the rate at which water is hitting the soil. So if raindrops are hitting blades of grass or other kind of horizon type of material, and then kind of having to flow back and forth across that material before they hit the soil surface, by the time they're hitting the soil, they're going to be moving a lot more slowly. So it's really impacting the rate at which the water is eventually hitting the soil. And as we talked about already, that's going to influence whether any soil aggregates or soil is going to be kind of dislodged, broken down, and vulnerable to be moved off site. And then, of course, this is all going to lead to limited drainage, and then that's going to lead back to more surface flow, as we talked about above. And then also, we just know that water, right, its whole goal in life is to move downhill, right? It's being influenced by gravity, and it's always going to be following the path of least resistance down the slope as it's being pulled by gravity. And so guess what? The open road provides this really great open, low resistance pathway that water can move along down slope. And so as we have these exposed areas, water is going to preferentially flow along these kind of undisrupted flat surfaces. And they're going to pick up speed. And as they pick up speed and pick up volume, they're going to be able to do even more damage. And so it's not surprising that we get sheet flow across roads and rills across roads, and then big gullies cut into roads that aren't built really properly. So our goal in kind of dirt roads, whether that's in forest land or other kinds of landscapes, is to get water off the road as soon as possible. We want to limit the time that water is moving across the road and limit the amount of road that the water is moving across. And so in general, what we want to do is we want to make the side slope of the road, the kind of the slope of the road itself, steeper than the long slope of the road that you're driving, that you would be driving along, right? So you want the water as it's flowing downhill to flow to one side or the other off the road, preferentially, rather than down along the road. And so you can do this by outsloping, you can do this by insloping, or you can do this by having a crowned surface, which is more typical in like a bigger road, like freeways and stuff are built like this. But an outslope road is basically where the surface of the road that you're driving on actually isn't flat, but it's tilted with the slope of the road. So this is kind of like the lowest maintenance approach. This is typical for kind of temporary roads with just kind of dirt surface without a lot of infrastructure. And then hopefully the water is going to flow right off the side as it hits the road rather than along the road, building speed and accumulating soil particles. Of course, this is a little bit more risky for driving. This might increase your risk for driving off the road in this type of setting. On the other hand, many dirt roads with a little bit more kind of engineering are insloped roads, where the slope of the road is actually tilted back against the hillside. And then there's kind of a drainage ditch in between the hillside and the road. And then there's periodic culverts, which are big pipes that run from the ditch under the road and then to the kind of downslope side of the road that drain out that ditch. And that ditch often, well, anyway, so there might be soil that moves along that ditch as part of erosion, but hopefully it's not going to be the same level of soil that would be moving along that really compacted road there. And certainly, hopefully it's not doing damage to the road as it's moving through the ditch and hopefully moving through the culvert. Now, if you don't have a big enough culvert to accommodate all the water that's coming through, or if you're not going out and checking and maintaining culverts so they're getting plugged up, then you can start to have a problem. But this is one approach. And then a crowned surface is kind of a combination approach where you have the highest point in the middle of the road, and then you have road that's insloped on the uphill side and outsloped on the downhill side. And so you can have some water moving one way and some water moving the other way towards the ditch, and this would require culverts as well. And again, this is usually like the most engineered, largest traffic roads that have this kind of approach. But in all cases, the goal is just to like move the water off the road as fast as possible, limit contact time, and limit kind of area across which water might be moving on the road. Other approaches can be rolling dips and water bars. So if you've driven along roads, or this also could be applied to like trails that maybe aren't necessarily meant for like full vehicles, but for like hiking, biking, horseback riding, etc. And anyways, first of all, rolling dips are just little dips in the road so that the water coming from either direction is hopefully going to flow downhill to this point and then drain off to the side rather than continuing to flow along the whole length of the road and be able to do quite a bit of damage. And then water bars are basically just like barriers that water would run into, and then it kind of like funnels the water off to the side of the road. So in both cases, they're just kind of like areas that would trap and then siphon water off to the side, so it's not moving along this exposed compacted surface that we know is going to be really vulnerable to erosion. So in consideration about erosion of dirt roads, it's important to understand that maintaining all these dirt roads that we do in many of our public lands as well as private lands is a hugely expensive proposition. Of course, there's lots of good reasons to have these roads for recreational access and like firefighting, things like that. But it's also important to realize that it's a big expense. So for instance, outsloping an existing road might cost about $250 per 1,000 feet. So you can imagine you have a many multi-mile road, that's going to start to add up. Graveling a road, so that's almost like adding like a riprap to the surface of the road to reduce a contact between the actual soil particles and the raindrops, and then slowing down the water before it actually hits the real soil surface. is going to be much more than that, somewhere between $6,000 and $12,000 per 100 feet. So again, that can really add up quickly. Installing a culvert, of course, is very dependent on size, but here's a picture of this road. So they actually have to kind of remove all the road surface, put this pipe underneath, and then rebury it, and hopefully compact it and make it strong enough that that soil is not all going to be washed away. That's probably going to be like at least a $5,000 project for each culvert that you install. And then, you know, we also have to like clean out drainage ditches and then come along and maintain these culverts. All these things add up. So kind of an overall estimate, I pulled this off the Forest Service website, for overall major road upkeep is somewhere between $45,000 and $70,000 per mile. So when we think about all this public access that we have on lots of these public lands, and of course this can be on private lands too, it's just important to understand that this is a really big investment that we're making, especially if we're going to be doing this right and have roads that are going to be able to stick around in the long term. Okay, I think that's my last slide here. All right, that's a good stopping point.